Coming to you live from the Fireball that is Phoenix, Arizona, where we are roasting up some cybersecurity topics that matter to you and your business or organization. Cybersecurity, compliance, management, Net Concepts, helping your business achieve reliability, security, and productivity. And now, your host of Net Concepts, Aaron Wagner.
Hello, and welcome to Net Concepts with Aaron Wagner. Good afternoon, and a shout out and thank you to Robin Cote, our studio director. I'm Claire Wagner, and for this episode, we're going to flip the mic around. We are going to talk about Net Concepts and our mission. Net Concepts started up in 1997 right here in the Valley of the Sun. Good afternoon, Aaron. How are you today?
Fantastic.
That's great. It's only 108 degrees out today. What do you think about that?
Love it. Just absolutely love it.
And overcast.
Yeah.
So I think it's a welcome relief from the 118 that we hit.
But it's not raining.
I know.
Without rain, we don't get cooler temps. Without cooler temps, I can't go to the mountains. I can't go into the mountains. I can't drive my side-by-side at, my foot to the floor. Wind through my hair, all that.
It's a sure thing that if I go get my car washed, it'll rain within 48 hours. So I think I need to do that.
Great.
So, Aaron, tell me a little bit about Net Concepts and how did you arrive in the cybersecurity space?
Well, as you said, we started in 1997, and at that time, we were mostly building machines and doing break-fix type of work. The machines evolved into this thing where I wanted to create something that was reliable. It was something the customer could look at and say, yes, NetConcept built that, and they take pride in what they do. So that morphed into where we started managing networks. Back then, we noticed that these small businesses were getting attacked by China, and it was this group, and there's several of them, but one in particular was went by the code name 61398, and these people were just going after random companies and just hitting them over and over and over. So it caused us to take a dynamic shift, and that dynamic shift then morphed into more of a security posture. And then I went to work for an insurance company, and at the insurance company, the level of security had to go up. So we morphed more into that space, and several years later, here we are, and the security landscape has completely changed.
So I think that there's still a lack of awareness around supply chain security, like not only what's going on in our own business with regard to our cybersecurity posture, but also concerning ourselves with our vendors, right? Because we're all connected. Can you speak to us a little about that?
Yeah. So supply chain is interesting because, back to that idea of the small business not having anything to offer. Well, it turns out that when Target was hit by its supply chain attack, it changed the story for everybody. All of a sudden, people were looking at their vendors where they hadn't done that in the past, and the small business had become a threat to the larger business.
So companies need to be transparent and document what they're going to do to be more secure. And I know that this process can involve greater specificity if there's a regulatory framework like HIPAA or FINRA. But the breach that happened at Target happened like through their HVAC system. Can you remind us what happened there?
That's exactly what happened. So
no, I mean, like, how, like, mechanically, how does that happen?
Well, everything that there's vulnerabilities in just about any piece of, for example, there's this vulnerability that just came out called boot hole, and boot hole affects the bootloader, which is a piece of software that tells. So you have the hardware, which then passes the startup process to a bootloader, and that bootloader could be for Windows, could be for Linux, it could be for any operating system. But most of the time, when you have devices that say like are a thermostat or an HVAC system, or they're something that controls your car, it's going to be a little piece of Linux, and once you compromise that thing, whatever it is, then you can move laterally or literally from that device to other things on the network. So the interesting thing about Target is from what I recall, it was more from the home office. Somebody got scammed, but with a phishing scam. And then from the phishing scam, it turned into the technician, or it grabbed the technician's access, and then from the technician's access, it came down the pipe that way.
That's crazy. I can't even imagine that.
So, the interest in the thing about the Target attack it's in supply chain is that small businesses don't always have to have that kind of my customer is this giant company to have a supply chain issue. So if you take, for example, a vendor that's a street vendor, they could be selling hot dogs. And though the end customer is people coming off the street and buying the hot dogs from this vendor, if that hot dog person went to Fry's or Bash's or whatever and bought hot dogs that are prepackaged and off the shelf, that hot dog person is going to pay more for the hot dogs, where if they would go to a wholesaler and buy large quantities of hot dogs, they're going to get it at a lower price. Well, that large vendor or large wholesaler is now at risk by that customer who is the hot dog vendor who has the small operation. So supply chain attacks can happen from the customer end or from the vendor end. It doesn't necessarily matter because everyone intrinsically has a value, and that value is trust. Or to put it another way, the way we think of it in the tech world is you have an identity. Mm-hmm. And once that identity is compromised, you shouldn't be moving to the next step, which is authentication, right?
Right.
So your identity has a value. Once I identify who you are, then I'm going to assume everything that you say, like you send me in an email, that's Claire, right? And so if that becomes compromised, and the next email that I get, I look at it and I go, that might be a little bit strange coming from Claire, but, it is Claire, and maybe this is something she's trying to give me, so I'm going to open it, and then poof, it's something else because you were compromised.
So, yeah, I think I've heard you mention that companies are particularly vulnerable because employees may actually get phished by an email that was sent with the credentials of a top executive at the firm. And so the employee immediately trusts that email, right? What can that employee do, say, to mitigate, or prevent themselves from clicking that email or opening? Is it what you had mentioned that it doesn't sound like that's something that person would say? Is it something like that?
Well, that you're getting into is when somebody is emotional about an email that they've received, right? The CEO is communicating to me because mm-hmm. they don't normally send me emails. But hey, I want to impress my boss. I want to impress the owner of the company. I want to impress the CEO of the company, and I want to show that I'm on the ball. And that emotional response is what the hacker is hoping for. So what you're referring to is that emotional connection. And the way that you would deal with an emotional connection, again, that comes down to a training program. So all companies, doesn't matter who you are, if you have employees, and even for yourself, there are training programs that you can purchase that have phishing tests. They have like training videos that you can go through with multiple choice tests at the end to make sure that you understood what you were being taught. So those are the kinds of things that you could do when you talk about the CEO sent me an email. I mean,
because employees are still the number one source of vulnerability, right? I think more than any hardware or patches or software updates that may or may not be done in a network, it's still the employees that are the major source of these breaches.
Well, yeah, and you bring that up as far as all of the things that you can do to mitigate the network. When you talk about the latest thing, which is, well, my employees, they always lose, they have their password compromised, right? Mm-hmm. What's the answer? It's always, well, did you have two-factor authentication on their accounts? Well, no. Well, you got to put that because that's going to fix everything. Well, it does help. I mean, it's a layer, but all of those layers can be compromised when employees have improper training.
So I've heard you talk about being transparent. What does that look like for a small business?
Well, when we talk about transparency, you're not talking about the what you're talking about is the part where you can say, you're a small business, right? We go back to your risk to the larger company, right? So if you use like documentation or compliance and you say, I've done all the things that I need to do to protect myself. Mm-hmm. Well, how do I know as a large company that you've done that? I mean, you could tell me, well, I don't have anything to hide and I've done all the protections. If we could count on that word that you've done all the things that you can do, then we wouldn't have a problem with supply chain attacks, right?
Right.
I mean, it would be a non-issue. Where it's important is to keep in mind that documenting things and having that kind of, I can show that I'm compliant, opens new markets. So, you could go say, look, I've done all these things and create trust with a larger company. They're more likely to do business with you.
Well, that's a different way of looking at it. I think that there's usually a lot of fear around compliance, right? The fines that result from breaches, that cybersecurity tools are time-consuming, costly, complicated. But now you're talking about it in terms of it opening your business up to new markets.
Right. I mean, that's the thing, is that every time it's marketed, it's always marketed in a negative context, right? Which is, if you don't adhere to all these regulations, then the auditor is going to come knocking on your door, and then something bad's going to happen.
Right.
Everything when it comes to cybersecurity is mostly marketed in a way to say, if you don't do, then something bad will happen. Which, when we think of it from a cybersecurity person, we think of it in terms of you will be breached, and then what happens when you are breached? What's the response?
So what advice would you give to a small business, given that a breach is an eventuality? Mm-hmm. What processes should they have in place to get right back up if they are attacked?
Well, I mean, you got to go, you get to start back from scratch, which is old school. So the old school model is, well, did you back your stuff up, right?
Yep.
So then you move to the next layer. Next layer would be, okay, so you've got something covering your endpoints for the prevention layer. You know, prevention in itself is a layer, and it can consist of multiple different things, right? So you install an endpoint product, and then I, not a business owner, would go in and tweak it so that it's least privilege. Because I don't want, for example, on a workstation, there's no reason for incoming traffic into a workstation because it's a consumption device. So it should be all outgoing, and I'm, manipulating with a server, kind of in the terminal sense, right? Mm-hmm. Like a terminal. But when you look at it from just a business owner's perspective, I mean, the best thing you can do is to put something on the endpoint, and then you move. We talk about detection, which is something that detects activity on those devices. And then, you can go from there. And the next layer, which is one of the things I harp on all the time, which is, so you have Office 365. You are in the United States. Why does somebody who is in that security group in China have access to your tenant? Why do they have the ability to try and use your compromised email and password?
Yeah, so that actually makes me think, one of the things I've noticed with desktops, right? I mean, there's that your phone, your mobile device, and your desktop are basically cross-platform. And we're seeing nothing but apps, right, for both. So, I have to ask you about the buzz around TikTok. What do you have to say about that?
So TikTok, and I would put TikTok and Zoom in the same category because no matter what you do, as long as they're owned by a Chinese company, and Zoom isn't technically owned by a Chinese company, however, if you have resources and you have a business that's operating within the borders of China, you have to have certain elements of the CCP. You have to comply with their regulations, which allow for access to your infrastructure. So, come back to the point of you are technically owned by the CCP, right?
Right.
So, let's take an example of what happened with Zoom, because TikTok hasn't had any consequences that are visible yet, but we'll get back to that. Zoom, there were some citizens of the United States that had left China. Mm-hmm. They did a Zoom meeting on Tiananmen Square. They were then Zoom was contacted by the CCP and said, cut those users' access off. Close their accounts. Mm-hmm. And Zoom complied. There's enough of an influence within that company, they had to comply. And what does that tell you? It says no matter what patches they do as far as security goes, no matter what privacy protections they put in place, they're always going to have to comply with the CCP. So it really doesn't matter. When it comes to TikTok, no matter what kind of security and privacy protections they put in place, they're always going to have to adhere to the CCP. And, for example, they were caught with the being able to have access to the clipboard on iOS devices. They were called out. They said they were going to stop. And then lo and behold, several months later, they were still doing it because TikTok is a device for the CCP in the sense that with that program, they can know more about you than they wouldn't without it. I mean, they know people's political stance. They know members of family. They know where you live. They know way too much information about people in the United States. And then you look at what happened with Zoom, and if you apply that same principle to people on TikTok, and you add on top of that the new law that says in China, if you talk bad about the CCP, and it doesn't matter whether you live in Hong Kong, whether you live in China, or you live in the United States, you talk bad about the CCP, there's consequences. And now, they're not going to come to my house and pick me up and take me to, the death camp or whatever. But if I wanted to see the Great Wall of China, I can't. Most likely. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would assume so. If I went to China, I'd probably be picked up and said, well, you hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, and, probably be arrested.
So because of that, the points that you just raised about the ownership, is that the reason why there's talk about Microsoft possibly buying out TikTok, and would that allow that ownership to mitigate that risk or exposure in the United States for users of TikTok in the United States or anywhere else?
I'll tell you an interesting story. It's about Google. Google recently went to Congress and said, we know of no issues where China has compromised our stuff. Well, okay, but what happened to you the first time you were there? Because they had a data center in China. Mm-hmm. It was actually members of the CCP who went to the data center, accessed servers. In fact, one of my accounts back in the day was compromised from that activity. Well, Google decided that they didn't want to. They pulled out of China. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it doesn't matter the size of the company that purchased it, and it doesn't matter that it's a company in the United States. They would have to pull TikTok from China to the United States. That means servers where anything is stored. That means employees would have to be let go from within TikTok, and they would have to move all development to the United States.
Wow. So that brings us to who's going to be our guest at our next episode, and that's going to be the CEO of Toria. And obviously with the pandemic, we've all changed the way we work and the way we collaborate, and people are using apps like, as you mentioned, Zoom and Teams ubiquitously, right? So what makes a product like Toria different? So
when Toria approached our company, I looked at it as, well, Teams is out there, and why would if I purchased Office 365 and I have Teams, why would I need anything else? Mm-hmm. I know Zoom is got its issues, and supposedly they're supposed to fix that. And again, we've covered why ultimately there is no fix unless they make significant changes in how it's operated.
Right.
I looked at Teams, and lo and behold, it is not end-to-end encrypted. So Toria is end-to-end encrypted, but the way you compare, they operate in a similar way Signal operates, which is you have access to the key. The government doesn't have access to the key, the encryption key. So Toria is the same way. You have access to the encryption key. They do not. So let's say you had some intellectual property that you wanted to protect. Mm-hmm. You have some thing that you make better than anybody else in the world. Well, you actually have a platform that you can have conversations about this type of thing, and no government, no other person, without compromising that key, could easily break into the conversation.
That's fantastic. So, Aaron, tell us what the value of using Net Concepts instead of going direct to a company like Toria?
So Net Concepts is kind of, think of like a house, right? You could go and you could buy the cement yourself. You can buy the lumber. You could buy the roofing. You can buy all of that stuff on your own. And, these days, with everything being online, you might be able to get it cheaper. That's possible. But who's going to build it? Who's going to actually have the know-how of building it? Because that's really what we do and then I get back to like that prevention layer of the endpoint protection. And we talk about, what can a business owner do as far as protecting their systems versus what I can do. The depth that Net Concepts can get to when it comes to protecting and preventing an attack is far deeper than when the average business owner is going to be able to understand. Because, it's time-consuming, technical, and all those things. They got other things to do. They want to run a business doing something other than IT. So that's the value of dealing with Net Concepts. We are the carpenter. We are we make that house a top-tier house.
And I think that partially, too, I think doesn't the average company or the average information technology officer at a company have to deal with some ungodly number of vendors? I think it's in the tens, right? I think it's like, how many? 70 different vendors? Yeah,
and portal integration is difficult. So you have all these different places you have to go to manage all these different systems. It's a very complicated thing when incident response needs to be just absolutely quick. The numbers on how fast the Russians and the Chinese can compromise a network. Well, and I think North Korea is up there pretty good too. How fast they can actually compromise a network from the initial attack to the lateral movement. It's pretty insane.
That's great. So, Aaron, if someone wanted to follow you and see what you're looking at and talking about, how would they get in touch with you?
So, yeah, you can go to ncarizona.net. That's our website. You could go to, follow me on LinkedIn, Aaron Wagner, Net Concepts AZ. If you go to Twitter, it's just Net Concepts AZ.
Well, thanks for taking the time to join Net Concepts with Aaron Wagner today. I'm Claire Wagner signing off. Keep an ear out for our interview with the CEO of Toria that drops August 16th.
Thank you for listening to Net Concepts with your host, Aaron Wagner. For more info, please go to ncarizona.net. Net Concepts, helping your business achieve reliability, security, and productivity.